Welcome to Citizen Portal, the federal edition, your go-to source for everything happening in federal politics. Let's dive in and keep you connected to what matters most on the national stage. All right, so we're diving into something that's sparking some pretty heated debates right now, U.S. energy policy. We're going behind the scenes of a recent House Energy Subcommittee hearing, and let me tell you, things got a little intense.
You could say that, yeah. Really got a sense of the different perspectives and how much is at stake when we talk about energy in this country.
Exactly. And we're talking about, industry experts, union leaders, even legal minds, all weighing in on how America, keeps the lights on.
It's a microcosm, this hearing, of this bigger conversation happening all across the country. How do we balance the need for economic growth with concerns about the environment and making sure we're secure as a nation?
And let's be real, the stakes are high. We're going to be talking about real people's livelihoods here, the future of whole communities. But before we get into all that, just a quick mind-blowing fact. Did you know that the U.S. uses more electricity than any other country in the world? And get this, that demand is about to go through the roof.
It's true. The EIA, they're projecting record-breaking electricity consumption. Think about it. Data centers, those massive hubs that, power the internet, those alone are projected to double, maybe even triple their energy use in just the next few years. And then add in the shift to electric cars, the manufacturing boom, the AI rates. It's clear we're going to need a lot more energy, period.
But the real question is, how do we get there? That seems to be,
the million-dollar question, right. And, the hearing really laid out two very distinct approaches. On one hand, you've got Republicans pushing for what they call American energy dominance, basically a return to, relying mainly on fossil fuels.
Got it. So that's one side. What about the other?
Democrats, they're really emphasizing a rapid shift to cleaner sources. So, wind, solar, those kinds of things. It's a real clash of visions, almost like two different paths for America's energy future.
So different paths. Did the hearing give any concrete examples of this divide?
Oh, yeah, for sure. Right from the opening statements, you could see the battle lines being drawn. One Republican committee member, they argued that, the previous administration had really unlocked all these abundant resources through all sorts of things, permitting reforms, initiatives like the Advance Act, that Nuclear Fuel Security Act. They argued all this set the stage for, this next generation of nuclear power.
Interesting. And how did Democrats respond to that? What did they say?
One Democrat on the committee, they countered by saying that recent executive orders that were designed to, boost fossil fuels were basically gifts to big oil companies. They were really critical, argued it was all about profits, not actually helping working families or lowering energy prices, which is something everyone's concerned about.
Right. So right away, there's this tension between economic benefits for businesses and then affordability, what everyday people can actually, afford to pay. And I know a big focus was the impact on local communities, right? Especially in those areas where a lot of the energy is actually produced.
Yeah, exactly. The hearing really zeroed in on Southeast Texas. It's like the energy hub of the entire nation. 7 major ports, 3 facilities that handle liquefied natural gas, LNG, a massive chunk of the Strategic Petroleum Reserve, and 7 of the largest U.S. refineries. The congressman representing that area, he had a lot to say.
It's not just policy, right? It's about real stuff. Jobs, schools, hospitals, the things that make a community tick.
That's what he emphasized. He argued that these energy facilities, they're the backbone of that whole local economy. They fund essential services, they create jobs, and he was, very critical of policies that he believes have hurt those communities, led to job losses, economic hardship, the real nitty-gritty stuff.
Yeah, that's a powerful reminder that these debates we're talking about have real-world consequences. And speaking of real people, we heard from someone representing the folks who are really, at the heart of this industry.
Absolutely. Gary Arnold, a union leader, he represents the pipe fitters, gave some powerful testimony, really spoke about how policy changes, project delays, they impact workers directly, their families too, creates a lot of uncertainty, a lot of anxiety.
Makes sense. What kind of impacts did he highlight? What stood out?
He talked a lot about the construction industry, which relies heavily on those big infrastructure projects, pipelines, for example. When projects get stalled or even canceled, it can lead to layoffs, real economic hardship for workers and their families. He also stressed how important worker training is, in the energy sector. He pointed out that unions and contractors, they invest over $300 million every single year to ensure that the workforce is highly skilled.
300 million. That's a serious commitment. I mean, it emphasizes how much is on the line for these workers. Their livelihoods are tied to this industry's success. Any little change in policy can have huge ripple effects.
Exactly right. Arnold's testimony really brought this human dimension, this human face to what can often feel like, a very abstract policy debate.
Right. So far we've got this clash over energy sources, fossil fuels versus clean energy. And we're seeing the economic impact, the workforce impact, especially in places like Southeast Texas. What else was on the table at this hearing? What else came up?
Well, there was another big sticking point, and that was the process of actually getting these energy projects approved. It's called the permitting process, and it can be incredibly complex and time-consuming. It can take forever.
I've heard horror stories.
Years of paperwork, environmental reviews, legal challenges, the whole works. It's so complicated, it can take longer to get a pipeline approved than it does to, well, get a college degree.
Oh, wow. Okay, that's insane.
Yeah.
So what's the solution? I mean, is there a clear answer?
No easy answers here, and this is where the political divide comes back into play. Republicans, they generally want to streamline the whole process. They argue these delays, they're stifling economic growth, preventing the U.S. from becoming truly energy independent. Too much red tape.
Yeah, that makes sense. So what's the other side? What are the Democrats saying?
Democrats, they acknowledge that some reforms probably needed, but they're a lot more cautious about just, streamlining everything. They argue that, we got to make sure that we don't sacrifice environmental protections just for the sake of speed. And they really emphasize the importance of community input, making sure that local communities have a voice, throughout the whole process.
Yeah, it sounds like a classic balancing act, right? Trying to find that sweet spot where we can develop these resources efficiently, but without, trashing the environment or ignoring what people in those communities are saying.
Exactly. And that whole balancing act, it extends to another really controversial topic that came up, exporting liquefied natural gas.
I know it's become a major player in the whole global energy scene, but can you break it down for me? Why is it so controversial? What's the big deal?
Well, liquefied natural gas, it's basically natural gas that's been, cooled down to a liquid. Makes it a lot easier to transport, to trade internationally. And the U.S., we've become a major exporter of LNG in recent years. And that's kind of sparked this debate about, what does it mean for the economy? What are the geopolitical implications? All that.
I see. So who's for it? Who's against it? How does that break down?
Republicans, they tend to argue that, expanding LNG exports is a win-win. It strengthens America's position on the world stage because, we can provide energy to allies and partners, and it boosts our economy, creates jobs, generates revenue, the whole nine yards. They see it as a really key tool for projecting American influence and countering, those other big energy-producing nations.
So it's kind of like energy diplomacy in a way.
Exactly. But of course, there are concerns about, sending all this energy overseas. What does that mean for us here at home? And Democrats, well, they're a little more cautious.
What are their main concerns?
One of their big worries is what happens to domestic energy prices. If we're sending more and more LNG abroad, it could push prices up here at home. And that obviously hits consumers in the wallet. They also worry that increased exports could actually end up benefiting China, which is, the world's biggest importer of LNG.
Right. So there's that concern about, unintentionally helping a geopolitical rival.
Yeah, exactly. And those concerns, they were really amplified by the whole situation in Europe after Russia invaded Ukraine. The U.S., we ramped up those LNG exports to help our European allies so they could, rely less on Russian gas. Mm-hmm. And that move was pretty widely seen as a strategic win, but it also contributed to those rising energy prices here in the U.S., which just shows how tricky it can be, using energy as this diplomatic tool.
Yeah, it's a reminder that everything has these ripple effects. Mm-hmm. And we've got to be, really careful about unintended consequences. Now, on a totally different note, the hearing also touched on a more controversial solution, nuclear power. And specifically, this newer type of reactor, those small modular reactors, the SMRs. Can you tell us a little bit more about those?
Sure. SMRs, they're basically, miniaturized nuclear reactors. They're designed to be more flexible, more scalable, potentially safer than those big traditional nuclear plants. And they offer some really interesting advantages, like modularity, which means they can be built in factories and then, shipped to the site. And that could reduce construction costs and those super long timelines. And because they're smaller, they need less land and they can be integrated into the existing energy grid a lot more easily.
So it's kind of like the next generation of nuclear tech, right? It sounds promising, but I'm sure there are still some big concerns.
Of course, of course. Nuclear power, no matter what form it takes, it comes with a lot of, baggage. Safety is always a top concern. And SMRs, well, they haven't been around long enough to really, build up that track record that can completely put those fears to rest. Waste disposal, that's another, perennial challenge. And there's still a lot of questions about whether SMRs will actually be more cost effective, than those big traditional plants. And even if they are cheaper to build, nuclear projects, they're kind of notorious for going way over budget and those delays.
Yeah, it sounds like one of those high risk, high reward situations, and the debate over nuclear power is, well, it's definitely not going away anytime soon. And this whole hearing, it really drives home just how complex U.S. energy policy is. There's no magic bullet, right? There's no one size fits all solution.
Yeah, that's for sure. And that was a theme that kept coming up over and over again. It's all about finding the right balance between, well, what are often competing interests: economic growth versus environmental protection, energy independence, but making sure consumers can still afford it, national security versus international cooperation.
So many factors to consider and so much at stake. What do you think were the most important takeaways from this hearing? What really stood out to you?
For me, it was the human element. We heard from people whose livelihoods are directly impacted by the decisions being made in Washington. The congressman from Southeast Texas talking about his constituents, Gary Arnold speaking on behalf of those workers on the front lines. I mean, those voices, they really brought home the fact that these aren't just abstract policies, right? They have real consequences for real people.
It's a really good reminder that, behind all the statistics and the political back and forth, there are real people whose lives are touched by these choices. It's not just some theoretical debate. And it sounds like there aren't any easy answers, are there? Just tough choices, trade-offs, no matter which path we choose.
That's exactly right. And this hearing really underscored that.
So where do we go from here? What are some key questions we should be asking ourselves as we try to navigate this energy crossroads, I guess you could call it?
One of the biggest questions, I think, is, if the U.S. wants to stay in that top spot as a global energy leader, what sacrifices are we willing to make as individuals and as a nation, right? Are we ready to really embrace this rapid shift away from fossil fuels, even if it means, some economic disruption? Are we okay with the risks that come with, expanding nuclear power? How do we balance that need for energy independence with the responsibility of dealing with climate change?
Big questions, for sure. This hearing was a real deep dive into just how complex this whole thing is. But it's clear the conversation's, it's far from over. What are your final thoughts for our listeners? They continue to sort of explore this topic.
I think the most important thing to remember is that energy, it affects every aspect of our lives, from the jobs we have to the prices we pay at the pump to the health of the planet, right? It's crucial that we stay informed, that we participate in these conversations, and that we hold our elected officials accountable for making choices that reflect our values and our priorities.
Absolutely. We can't just sit back and be passive about this. It's about our future, and we all have a say in it.
To our listeners, thanks for tuning in to this deep dive on U.S. energy policy. It's a complex issue with no easy answers, but as we've heard, it's one that affects us all. So stay engaged, stay informed, and let's work together to build a brighter energy future.
Thanks for tuning in to Citizen Portal. We hope you feel more informed and ready to engage with the issues shaping our community. Be sure to subscribe so you never miss an update, and visit us at citizenportal.ai for more insights on how local politics are impacting you. Until then, stay engaged, stay informed, and remember, your voice matters.